Hello and welcome to SAPUI5 demos. In the previous demo, I showed you how to pass a parameter from one view to another view, but we didn't take advantage of the two-way data binding. So in this demo, I'm going to cover data binding, and I'm going to show you what's the difference between one-way data binding and two-way data binding. But before we get into all this, there are a few things that you should know if you are new to JavaScript and if you're new to SAPUI5. So there are a few areas where I think you should get confused, and there are a few demos or few tutorials where people use var name is equal to something John, and in few cases they don't use var, they just write name is equal to John, and in few places they use this dot name is equal to John. So what's the difference between all these three? So that's what we are going to cover right now. To do that, I'm going to create a small function. Let's say get or set username, and this function is going to accept a parameter, and I am going to place that parameter inside this. I'm going to say var username is equal to para. Now, very common function, right? But the reason why I have used var over here is you won't be able to access this particular variable from outside this function. So the scope of this variable is only within this method. But if I remove var from here, I can access this variable from anywhere. It is in global scope. So this is the way I have initialized my variable, and I'm directly passing parameter. Now if I type set username, and if I write John Dave, and if I try to print my username, I can print it. Now you see I'm trying to access this variable outside this function, and this is going to work. So I get John Dave here, and the next thing is I'm going to prepend var over here. Now this is going to be in the local scope, and this variable can only be accessed within this function. So now if I try to hit run, it says undefined. It didn't get this variable, right? So that's the difference between when to use var and when not to use var. Now let's come to this. So what does this keyword do? In order to explain that, I'll create a small object for user is equal to, and I'm going to write username. This is a key which is blank right now, and then I'm going to set username. This is a method, and it is going to accept a parameter. And now if I want to access this particular variable or this particular key, I need to use this dot username, okay? Because this particular thing, this two braces that you see, this is object, and you usually work with objects using this keyword. So this is nothing but user. So you can either write user.username, this is correct, or you can write this dot username to access this variable, and then we pass para here, right? Now if I want to set this username, all I have to do is user dot set username. So this is the object. I'm accessing this method, and I'm going to save it, pass a username which is John Dave. And now if I have to access this username, I just have to type console.log user.username, right? So this is going to give me John Dave. There it is. And you can replace this with user because this is nothing but user. So you can write user. So it is going to get into the user object, and it is going to access this variable, and it is going to place parameter over here. So if I refresh this to clear the cache, and if I run, it still gives me John Dave, right? So that's the difference between all these three. Now let's get into data binding and see how it works. So I'm going to use the previous application which I had already developed and which I demonstrated in demo 3. But before we make changes, let's have a quick recap of what we did. So we enter a secret word. It can be anything, A, B, C, D. and when I click on submit, it gives me ABCD over here. Now what this is doing exactly, the moment I hit submit, it is getting the word for me, which whatever I have typed inside this input box. So it gets me that string, and then it sets the data inside the model, and then we set the model inside the core so that it becomes globally available. And any other views which are listening to this model or which are dependent on this model, the model pushes the data from the model to the view. So that is called two-way data binding, right? To give a short note on one-way and two-way data binding, there are two things. Let's start with one-way data binding. So in one-way data binding, we have the UI, and let's say this is an input box, and the UI is not going to push any data to the model automatically, right? So we have to write our logic somewhere here, and then it is going to push the data into our model, and the model then automatically pushes this data to our view, right? So the previous demo we used one-way binding. So when we hit submit, it is going to set the data, and then we are going to set the data inside the model, and then the model is going to update the other view. So the two-way binding does all these things automatically. So what it's going to do, we have the UI, we have the input box, and it is going to push all the data to the model the moment we start typing inside our input box, and the model then is going to push those data into our view. So this is one way, this is two-way binding, right? The model can accept the changes automatically, and it can push those changes back to the view. But in one-way binding, the model is not able to accept the changes, but it can push those changes to the view. So let's go ahead and create a two-way binding. So to do that, we are just going to cut this part of code, and we are going to paste it on our onInit method. So the onInit method gets triggered when the application has rendered and when the UI elements are in place, and at that point this gets triggered, and this is going to get triggered only once, right? So what we are going to do here, we can remove this dot model because we are not accessing this model from anywhere. So we can initialize it with var, and we can remove this from here. So once we have initialized the model using var, we don't have to use var again because that will reset the model. It is going to initialize it again. So now we have some value with our model, and we just pass that value here. We don't use var anywhere, right? And so now we take my secret and we go to page 1, and we had earlier hard-coded value here. We are not going to do that at the moment. We are going to write my secret. So this is the way we bind this UI element with the model. So the moment I start typing, it is going to update the model, and the model in turn is going to update this particular view, the page 2 view, and it's going to update the text view. So when to change this from my model, and now if we go and preview this, so the moment I write anything, let's say hello world, and I directly go to page 2, I'm not going to hit submit, and you see hello world is written here. So it is, everything is done automatically. All right, another word magic, and the magic is here. So what is this? Is two-way binding. So how do we turn this into one-way binding? What one-way binding is going to do, the moment I type something over here, it is not going to update anything over here, but if I change the model programmatically, it is going to reflect that data over here. So let's go ahead and remove var from here. We are removing var because we want to make this model global so that we can change the model from outside this application. Okay, and we can remove, we can copy this thing from here, and we are going to set it. And one more thing, we have to say that my model is going to accept one-way binding. So we write that by using set default binding mode, and we write here sap.ui.model.binding mode.one way. right? So we have set our model to accept only one-way kind of data passing. Now if I refresh this and I type anything over here and I go to page 2, it doesn't show me anything. Now the reason I had removed var from here was to make it accessible, to make it a global object so that I can access it from outside the application, right? So let's copy this part and let's get into our console. And so my secret, this I'm going to place a value here, let's say hello SAPUI5, and because my model is global right now, there is no var over here, I can access it from here, and then I'm going to set the data. So if I go to page 2, I'm going to change the model and you'll see that the model will push those changes inside my view. I hit on run and it says hello SAPUI5. So I hope you understand the difference between the one-way and two-way data binding. And if you have any questions or if you have not understood anything, drop me a comment and I'll try to explain it in the next video. Thanks for watching.